In the heart of a courtroom where the weight of justice hangs by a thread, Amina Johnson, a black woman, faces the unyielding forces of extreme racism and systemic bias. The arrogant attorney James Harding dismisses her voice, convinced her opinion doesn't matter, not knowing that she's the juror who will decide the fate of this case. But as the trial spirals toward its explosive climax, Amina makes a choice that will shatter not only the courtroom, but the very system that seeks to silence her. You won't believe what she did next, even if you've seen it all before. But let's start at the beginning. The courtroom was tense as the trial began. James Harding, a confident and seasoned white attorney, was representing a massive corporation accused of environmental damage. He was ruthless, using every possible tactic to manipulate the witnesses and sway the jury. His strategy was simple: play to the biases of the room, leverage his privilege, and make anyone questioning his client's actions look like they were emotionally driven, not logical. Among the jury members was Amina Johnson, a composed and intelligent black woman who sat quietly in her seat, her sharp eyes tracking every movement, every word spoken. She had heard the arrogance in Harding's voice when he addressed the court, and it unsettled her deeply. The way he spoke as though he already knew the outcome, as if the jury's opinion was a mere formality, was infuriating. But she kept her thoughts to herself. For now, Amina had learned that in spaces like this, her voice was often disregarded before she even spoke. She was used to being unseen. Harding began his cross-examination of the defense's star witness, an environmental activist who had spent years researching the damage caused by the corporation's pollution. The activist was a passionate, knowledgeable woman, but Harding wasn't interested in her facts. Instead, he launched into a vicious attack, mocking her work and accusing her of being driven by an emotional agenda rather than the truth. He painted her as unprofessional, using every stereotype to reduce her credibility, all while dripping with sarcastic disdain. He knew that his words were not just directed at her, but at the very heart of the case: the environmental damage that was silently destroying communities, including Amina's own. As Harding's words hit the activist like a storm, Amina could feel the weight of the attack. She watched as the other jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some exchanging doubtful glances. They were beginning to question the validity of the witness's testimony. The look on their faces told Amina everything she needed to know. Harding was getting to them. He was winning, not because of the facts, but because of the manipulation. His poison was seeping into the minds of the jurors, planting seeds of doubt that threatened to undo everything. Amina clenched her fists under the table. Her heart raced, and a wave of frustration coursed through her. She wanted to speak, to stand up and correct the narrative that Harding was painting. He was distorting the truth, and she couldn't stand it. But as the words gathered in her mind, they seemed stuck in her throat. The reality of the situation hit her hard. If she intervened now, would her voice be drowned out by the weight of the room's prejudices? As Harding continued his verbal assault on the witness, Amina noticed something else. The room was growing quieter. Some of the jurors were no longer making eye contact with her. They were avoiding her gaze, as if they didn't even recognize her presence. It was a familiar feeling, being invisible in spaces where your opinion didn't matter. But today, it was different. She wasn't going to let this injustice slide. She could feel the anger building, but also the resolve. Amina knew that if she didn't find a way to be heard, Harding would get away with it. As the cross-examination ended and the room fell into a tense silence, Amina sat there determined. She couldn't stay silent anymore. She had to figure out how to make her voice matter, how to be the difference between the truth being buried or rising to the surface. It wasn't just the activist's testimony at stake, it was the entire case, and with it, the lives of many people affected by the corporate greed Harding was defending. And she, Amina Johnson, would not let that go unchallenged. As the trial progressed, the tension in the courtroom thickened. James Harding, a skilled and ruthless attorney, had been pushing his manipulative agenda with unrelenting precision. The jury, especially those who didn't know much about the subject of environmental damage, were slowly falling under his influence. He didn't need to convince them with facts. He just needed to play on their biases, their preconceived notions about the importance of corporate power, and most importantly, their ability to be swayed by his charm and sharp tongue. With each passing day, Harding's tactics grew bolder. He started making subtle jabs at the environmental advocates, casting doubt on their credibility and their motives. His insults were not just aimed at the defense. They were aimed at people like Amina, people who were more concerned with the well-being of the planet than with corporate profit. In one of his most cutting remarks, he dismissed Amina and the other jurors of color, insinuating that they lacked the understanding of the real importance of the economy and couldn't possibly grasp the complexities of corporate operations. The words stung Amina deeply, not just because of their blatant racism, but because they were rooted in a stereotype she had battled all her life. People like her, people from working-class communities, black communities, weren't seen as having the intelligence or the authority to understand the so-called big picture. It wasn't just a personal jab, it was a direct attack on her very existence. Amina's chest tightened with anger. Harding's words weren't just offensive, they were dangerous. They were meant to undermine the whole case by reducing the jurors, especially her, to stereotypes. It would have been easy to retreat, to stay silent, to keep quiet and let the process play out. But Amina couldn't. She wouldn't. In that moment, a shift occurred inside her. She realized that Harding's game was nothing new. She had seen this before in corporate offices, in schools, on the street. People like him using their power to manipulate, to hide the truth, and to keep the status quo intact. But she was done being silent. She would show him exactly how his manipulations worked, and she would do it by using his own tactics against him. Amina stood up during one of Harding's cross-examinations of a witness, and with a calm but firm voice, she began asking him questions. The questions seemed innocuous at first, but with each one, she pushed Harding further into a corner. His responses, once sharp and self-assured, began to falter. He stuttered. His eyes darted, trying to find his footing, but it was clear he wasn't ready for someone like Amina to challenge him directly. One question after another, she began to dismantle his arguments. He was no longer the cool, collected attorney who could manipulate the court with his words. He was exposed. His own strategy, the one he had honed for years, was starting to crack. Amina's voice was steady, but her heart pounded in her chest. For the first time in the trial, she felt in control. But just as she thought she had him cornered, Harding quickly recovered. He turned his attention away from her and instead directed his comments to a different juror, a man sitting across the room. He dismissed Amina's pointed questions with a dismissive wave, turning back to someone he thought he could manipulate more easily, someone who looked more like him. In that moment, a cold wave of frustration washed over Amina. She knew exactly what was happening. Harding was using the racial dynamics of the room to his advantage. He thought that by ignoring her and focusing on the more acceptable jurors, he could shift the conversation back to his favor. He was counting on the others to dismiss her, to see her as less important, less capable, just like he had done to so many people in the past. It was a cruel, predictable tactic, but Amina was not going to be silenced. She could feel the weight of her ancestors, the women, the fighters, the survivors, pushing her forward. This was her moment, and she was not going to let him win. She knew that Harding's game was built on people like her staying quiet, staying small. But now, with her voice, she could make a difference. The pressure was mounting. As the trial continued, the other jurors began to question her stance. Some of them looked at her with doubt, unsure of whether to follow her lead. The weight of their judgment was heavy on her shoulders, but Amina refused to back down. The battle wasn't just about this case anymore. It was about all the people who had been silenced for too long, whose stories had been dismissed by people like Harding. Amina took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and silently vowed that she would make her voice heard, no matter the cost. She would not let this trial, a trial that could change the course of so many lives, be another example of injustice. She would push back against the system that sought to silence her. And with that resolve in her heart, she prepared herself for the next stage of the battle. Her trial had reached a critical juncture. The air was thick with anticipation as both sides prepared for their final arguments. James Harding, feeling the pressure mounting against him, decided it was time for a new tactic. With a calculated smirk, he accused the jury of bias, of letting their emotions cloud their judgment instead of relying on the hard facts of the case. He suggested that the jurors, particularly those like Amina, were allowing their personal feelings about corporate responsibility to influence their decision-making. He pointed his finger at them, accusing them of being too invested in the emotional side of the case to properly assess the evidence. The room held its breath. Harding was going on the offensive, trying to cast doubt not just on the witnesses, but on the entire jury. It was a classic move, a way to sow discord and make his opponents look unprofessional, out of touch, and irrational. But Amina wasn't having it. Her pulse quickened, but her mind was clear. She had prepared for this moment. She had seen this kind of maneuver before. This was a calculated attempt to undermine her, to make her feel like she didn't belong in this space. Amina leaned forward, her eyes steady and unwavering. She knew what needed to be done. Harding's accusations weren't just an attack on her. They were an attack on the integrity of the entire judicial process. She wasn't about to let him get away with it. She raised her hand and asked permission to speak. The judge granted it, and the room fell into a heavy silence. Amina's voice cut through the tension, calm but firm. She addressed the court, making it clear that it was not the emotions that had clouded the proceedings, but rather the deliberate manipulation of facts by the defense. She had been watching closely, seeing how Harding had twisted every piece of testimony to fit his narrative, how he had attempted to discredit the witnesses and obscure the truth with his flashy arguments and smug confidence. It was his manipulation that had compromised the case, not her judgment. Amina began to ask questions of the witnesses, and each question she posed seemed to chip away at Harding's once impenetrable case. She started with the simplest inconsistencies, facts that Harding had glossed over or ignored. She brought up documents and statements that had been dismissed as irrelevant, but now they held weight. She forced the witnesses to confront contradictions in their testimonies, prompting them to reveal gaps in Harding's defense. The more Amina questioned, the more the cracks in Harding's argument widened. His composure began to slip. As the defense witnesses stammered under Amina's questioning, Harding became visibly agitated. He had expected to be the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now he was on the defensive. His sharp retorts were losing their sting, and his questions began to sound less confident. He tried to regain control by redirecting the focus back to the jury, back to the idea that they were all too emotionally invested, that the truth was being lost in the noise. But Amina was done being dismissed. She had already seen how Harding used his position to manipulate not just the court, but the very structure of the legal system. She could feel her resolve hardening, each question pushing her further into the fight. The truth was on her side, and now she would make sure it was heard. Just as Amina was gaining momentum, Harding made a drastic move. In a final attempt to destabilize her, he went personal. He launched an attack on her background, her past, trying to make her appear as if she were too emotionally charged to be impartial. He referenced her own struggles, her upbringing, the communities she came from, suggesting that her history made her too biased to truly understand the case at hand. He painted her as someone who wasn't capable of viewing the evidence objectively, as someone whose emotions and personal history made her an unreliable participant in the process. The room gasped. Amina could feel the weight of his words, the attempt to push her back into the shadows of her past. But this time, it didn't break her. It only solidified her determination. Harding's attack was meant to silence her, to make her feel small and insignificant. Instead, it gave her the clarity to speak more powerfully than she ever had before. Amina stood tall, her eyes piercing as she addressed the court. She didn't need to justify herself to anyone. Instead, she spoke of the system that had long ignored voices like hers. She spoke not just for herself, but for all the black men and women whose lives had been defined by prejudice, whose voices had been silenced by people like Harding. She spoke for the generations who had been told that their experiences, their pain, their truths didn't matter. But now, her voice would matter. Her truth would be heard. "I've seen this before," she said, her voice steady, cutting through the room like a knife. "I've seen how the system works to keep people like me from being heard, how it twists the facts to protect the powerful and the privileged. But that stops here. My voice, the voices of my community, we are just as valuable as anyone else in this room. And if you think for 1 second that I'm going to let you silence me, think again." Her words landed like a bombshell. There was no turning back now. Amina had broken the barrier that Harding thought he could control. She had dismantled his manipulations and made it clear that her voice was no longer something he could ignore. The room was silent for a moment, the weight of her statement hanging in the air. But in that silence, Amina knew she had already won. She had reclaimed her agency, she had turned the tables, and now it was up to the jury to decide whether they would stand by her truth or continue to let people like Harding dictate what was right and wrong. For the first time in the trial, Amina felt a deep, unwavering sense of peace. She had done what she had set out to do. She had shown the world, no, the system, that she would not be overlooked, not today, not ever again. As the trial wore on, the tension in the courtroom was palpable. Harding, once confident and in control, could feel the weight of his manipulations crumbling beneath him. Amina had turned the tide, and now, with every question she asked, with every word she spoke, the foundation of his defense was eroding. He had tried to belittle her, tried to silence her, but now he could no longer ignore the fact that her voice was powerful and it was gaining momentum. He had to act fast. With a calculated sneer, Harding turned to the jury and made an open, arrogant declaration. "It seems, ladies and gentlemen, that some voices in this room are given far more weight than others. But let me make this clear. Her voice," he gestured to Amina with a dismissive wave, "it doesn't matter. It is not the voice that will decide this case. Facts will." Amina's breath caught in her throat. The words stung, not just because of the blatant dismissal, but because Harding had underestimated her yet again. But instead of reacting with anger, she took a slow breath and met his gaze, her posture unshaken. She stood taller, the weight of the moment settling on her shoulders. This was not the time to falter. This was the moment she had prepared for. "Every voice matters, Mr. Harding," she said, her voice calm and measured, but her words carrying an undeniable weight. "And my voice will be the one that decides the outcome here, whether you like it or not." Her words hung in the air, echoing through the courtroom like a challenge. Harding's confidence wavered for the briefest moment before he attempted to dismiss her yet again. But Amina's resolve was like a steel wall. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing on her, every word she spoke now being watched and weighed carefully by everyone in the room. The entire trial had led up to this point, and there was no turning back. And then, in the midst of the mounting tension, the courtroom was shaken by an unexpected turn of events. One of the defense witnesses, who had remained silent for much of the trial, stood up. His testimony had seemed like just another piece of the corporation's defense, a weak link in their argument. But now, he spoke up in a way no one had anticipated. With a deep breath, he revealed crucial information. New evidence that had been kept hidden until now. Details that exposed the corporation's attempts to cover up critical data about the environmental damage they had caused. The facts that were buried beneath layers of manipulation, the truth Harding had so carefully obscured, now lay bare in front of the jury. Amina watched, heart pounding in her chest, as the room went still. The corporate defense was unraveling. This witness, who had remained quiet out of fear, or perhaps loyalty, had finally broken their silence, and the implications of his revelation were staggering. Harding's carefully crafted narrative was shattered in an instant, the lies and deceit that had held the case together crumbling before their eyes. Harding's reaction was immediate. His face reddened, and his hands clenched into fists as he tried to maintain his composure. He had expected to keep control of the trial, to win by dominating the conversation. But now, he was forced to face the truth that had been hidden for so long. But his pride, his arrogance, wouldn't allow him to admit that he had been outmaneuvered by a single piece of truth. Instead of acknowledging the blow to his defense, Harding attempted to regain control, refusing to show any vulnerability. He tried to pivot the conversation, redirecting it back to the witness's credibility, attempting to discredit the new evidence by focusing on the man's past affiliations, trying to plant seeds of doubt about his motives. But the damage had been done. The courtroom could feel the shift in the air, the overwhelming sense that justice was finally starting to weigh in on the side of truth. Amina felt a quiet victory stir within her. She had known this moment would come. She had seen it happen in so many trials before. When a person fights hard enough, when they refuse to be silenced, the truth always finds a way to surface. And this was her moment to witness that truth in action. The corporation, which had believed it could control the narrative, had finally met its match. As Harding floundered, trying to maintain his grip on the case, the jurors' eyes shifted. They were no longer looking at Amina with doubt. They were looking at her with something different now. Respect. They saw that the quiet, determined woman who had fought for truth had been the one to expose the lie that had been so carefully constructed. And with that, the balance of power in the courtroom had shifted. The judge, sensing the change, allowed the defense a brief moment to collect itself. But the damage was clear. Harding's arrogance had cost him. Amina's refusal to be silenced had cost him. The jury was watching, and now the weight of the evidence and the weight of Amina's steadfast resolve was undeniable. In that pivotal moment, Amina realized that this battle wasn't just about winning the case. It was about breaking the system that had allowed people like Harding to thrive. She had become more than just a juror. She had become a symbol of resistance, of truth, and of the voices that could no longer be ignored. And with every passing second, she knew that victory was within her grasp. The scale had finally tipped. The courtroom buzzed with a tension so thick it felt as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. After days of emotional highs and crushing lows, the trial was nearing its final moments. Harding had fought tooth and nail to maintain control, using every manipulative tactic in his arsenal. Yet, with each passing day, Amina's unwavering voice had chipped away at his facade. Now, the truth was laid bare, and justice was hanging by a thread. Amina stood at the center of it all, her heart racing, yet her mind was clear. She knew this moment would come, and she had prepared for it in the quietest corners of her mind. The moment of truth had arrived. She could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her, the eyes of the jury now fully focused on her. She had a choice to make: stay silent and let the system continue to favor those with power, or speak up and take the final step to ensure the truth won. Her decision came without hesitation. She rose to her feet, and the room fell silent, as if it knew something monumental was about to unfold. With her voice calm, but with the power of everything she had endured behind it, she addressed the court. "Mr. Harding," she began, her gaze unwavering, "I am a juror, and I will not allow you to manipulate this process any longer. I demand justice." Her words rang out, clear and firm. In an instant, the entire courtroom seemed to shift, the air charged with anticipation. Harding stood still, stunned by the force of her declaration. His mouth opened as if to respond, but for the first time in the trial, there was nothing he could say. Amina's statement had broken the final barrier. But it wasn't just a declaration of her own position. It was a declaration of defiance against the system that had long allowed people like Harding to bend the truth to their will. With those words, Amina set the stage for the final act of the trial. She wasn't just speaking for herself anymore. She was speaking for all those who had ever been silenced, who had been pushed aside by the powerful. Her voice was now a symbol of resistance, of the battle for fairness, equality, and accountability. She turned to the other jurors, her voice steady as she laid out the facts, meticulously and methodically. Every inconsistency, every lie, every shred of truth that Harding had tried to hide was now exposed. Amina spoke with a clarity that left no room for doubt. She wasn't just pointing out flaws in the defense. She was presenting the truth of the matter, the truth that had been obscured for too long. Amina didn't just challenge the facts. She challenged the very foundation of the system that had allowed corporate greed to thrive unchecked. She made it clear that the verdict wasn't just about the damages the corporation had caused. It was about a larger issue: the systemic inequality that had allowed people like Harding to profit from environmental destruction without accountability. The corporation's actions were the symptom of a much deeper illness within society. Harding, realizing the ground was slipping from beneath him, tried to salvage whatever remained of his credibility. His face reddened with frustration, and his voice rose in protest, but it was a hollow effort. His tactics had been exposed, his manipulations unraveled. The very strategies he had relied upon to win, his bullying, his dehumanizing comments, his calculated dismissals, were no longer effective. The jury looked at Amina differently now, their eyes filled with a mixture of admiration and respect. They understood that her words had not only changed the direction of the trial, but had also exposed the broader truth about how the system functioned. Her decision to speak up, to challenge the status quo, had given them the courage to see past the surface. And now they had to decide. With the final deliberations complete, the judge called for the verdict. The tension in the room reached its peak. As the judge read the decision, the entire courtroom fell silent in anticipation. The verdict was clear. The corporation was found guilty, and they were ordered to pay massive reparations for the environmental damage they had caused. But the true victory wasn't just in the financial penalty, it was in the justice that had been served. The courtroom erupted in quiet relief, but for Amina, it wasn't just about the verdict. It was about something far more profound. She had exposed a corrupt system, a system that had been designed to protect the powerful and silence the voices of the oppressed. And in doing so, she had broken through the walls of injustice that had stood for far too long. Amina's victory was personal, yes, but it was also collective. It was a victory for her community, for every black voice that had been marginalized in the courtroom. It was a victory for the countless people who had never had the chance to speak their truth. Amina had not just delivered justice in this case. She had become the living embodiment of it. As the trial ended and the courtroom began to empty, Harding stood, staring at the result of his defeat. For the first time, he realized the full weight of what had happened. He had underestimated Amina. He had underestimated the power of her voice, and he had underestimated the collective strength of truth. He had failed to manipulate the process, and he had failed to win. Amina, on the other hand, left the courtroom with a quiet strength. Her actions had not only changed the course of the trial, they had changed her. She had proven to herself and to the world that standing up for what is right, no matter the odds, is the ultimate act of courage. Her example became a beacon for others, a reminder that no one is too small to fight against injustice. She had shown that with integrity, perseverance, and courage, even the most powerful forces could be held accountable. And in doing so, she had become the very symbol of the justice she had fought for.